77 cases now have been confirmed in this country across 4 provinces. Most cases are in Ontario and BC. After today's carnage in stocks and oil prices, is the government readying any emergency measures? How should the upcoming federal budget respond to the coronavirus outbreak and its economic impact? We just listened to what Finance Minister Bill Morneau had to say. Darren Fisher is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Health. Next to him, Michael Cooper is the Conservatives' Deputy Finance Critic. And next to him, Peter Julian is the NDP's Finance Critic. All 3 of them join us from the House of Commons. Hi there. Thanks very much for being with us.
Good to be here. Good afternoon.
Mr. Fisher, I'm going to start with you. I know you're the Parliamentary Secretary, to the Minister of Health, but we just heard from Finance Minister Morneau. And I'm reading between the lines because he didn't directly answer it, but it sounds like your government is prepared to add to the deficit to combat the decline in revenues that must be expected thanks to what we saw take place today. Is that correct?
Yeah, so what I took from it, Vashi, was that we have the fiscal capacity to respond as need be. And this is the important thing, is what we're seeing here is we're seeing such a drastic change day to day. It's important that we have that fiscal capacity to be able to respond as needed.
When you say that you have the fiscal capacity, is that true? And I ask because that has been a primary criticism, particularly from the Conservatives towards your party. The deficit was forecast originally to be $19.8 billion for the 12-month period ending in March. It's now slated to hit more than $26 billion. That doesn't even account for the money you promised during the last campaign. Is it truly fair to say you have the fiscal capacity?
Absolutely. You know, what we've seen over the last few years, Vashi, is we've seen 1 million new jobs created. We've seen the best employment numbers in my lifetime. And, you know, we've seen a debt to GDP ratio going down just about every year that we've been in government. We have the fiscal responsibility to respond as needed.
Should, Mr. Cooper, the federal government add to the deficit to combat the instability in the economy right now?
Well, the government would like to point to coronavirus, but the fact is that this government abandoned its fiscal anchors since it was elected, and we've seen massive deficits, massive waste that have failed to deliver. And so in the last quarter of 2019, we actually saw anemic growth of just 0.3% in terms of GDP. That is a net negative on a per capita basis of GDP. So we have an economy that is slowing, and a government that has spent the cupboard bare when times are good without any contingent plan to deal with an economic downturn that we are now facing and that is being heightened by uncertainties such as the illegal blockades and coronavirus.
You know, Mr. Cooper, what the government would say in response, though, that if you look at the portion of debt as it relates to GDP in this country, it's lower than any G7. That's what they're referring to when they say they have the fiscal capacity. Do they have an argument there?
Well, the debt to GDP ratio has actually gone up, not down. And the fact is that...
But it's still a lot lower than it was in the past.
Well, they have blown through the budget. We're talking about now $30 billion deficits with no end in sight. And having regard for an economic downturn, it's not a stretch for $30 billion deficits to turn into 50 or 60 or $70 billion deficits. And they have not left that fiscal capacity. By contrast, when Stephen Harper was Prime Minister from 2006 to 2008, when times were good, he paid down debt, $38 billion, which was a record level of debt repayment. That gave Canada the fiscal capacity to respond to the worst global recession since the Great Depression in 2008 and 2009. No such capacity exists today.
And to be fair, he did add to the deficit to do that. Mr. Julian, I know your party has asked for some specifics from the government today. I listened keenly into what Minister Morneau was saying. It sounds like they are ready to announce something at some point this week, though they didn't have many specifics. What exactly do you want to see from the government?
Well, we believe that the government needs to be taking action. Jagmeet Singh was up in the House of Commons today asking for the government to put in place EEI provisions that allow people to stay home if they are sick with the coronavirus, to make sure that their income isn't impacted. The reality is we've got about 50% of Canadian families that are $200 away from insolvency in any one month. So if they don't have the ability to take sick leave, through their employment, they need to have other options. Otherwise, they're having to make that choice between going out if they're sick because they have to put food on their table or pay their rent and keep a roof over their heads. We also believe that the healthcare cuts that we saw under the Harper Conservatives that have been continued under the Liberal government need to be addressed. We need to have funding that is adequate so the healthcare system can actually respond to the extent to which the coronavirus is present. And so we've been saying that that cap that was put on, that essentially is a cut in healthcare, needs to be stopped, and that we need to see those kinds of investments in healthcare. Our concern is regular families, and they have been really impacted by the last couple of decades. We talk about a recession, but the reality is for Canadian families that are struggling with the highest family debt loads of any industrialized country, they've seen a recession for more than a decade because federal government has not been responding to their needs.
Are you talking specifically about healthcare transfers from the federal government to provinces? That's something provinces have asked for a while. I mean, the transfers have increased. They were in line basically with what had been promised by the previous government.
Absolutely, and they're not in line with the needs that are out there in the healthcare system. So cutting that, capping that at half what the actual needs are means that our healthcare system doesn't necessarily have the resources in place to deal with something like a coronavirus. That needs to change.
Okay, Mr. Fisher, just before Minister Morneau got on the screen, we were listening to Alberta Premier Jason Kenney, who says he's coming to Ottawa later this week. We know all the premiers will be here, but he has a specific list of asks. Of course, his province will be hit particularly hard right now with the price of oil declines that we saw today and that we've actually seen over the last week to a lesser extent. The Premier has asked, and he's joined actually by the Leader of the Opposition in this ask, just this ask, but for the federal government to remove its cap where fiscal stabilization is concerned. Will the federal government do so?
I missed that part of the interview, Vashi, so I can't speak to what Mr. Morneau will do on that. But what Mr. Morneau has been very, very clear about is being there to help. So what we saw the Prime Minister send a letter to his counterparts, the provincial, all the premiers. We saw the Minister of Health send a letter to all of her counterparts, seeking a list of what they need as it pertains to coronavirus, as it pertains to...
Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Fisher. This, with respect, is about more than coronavirus. This is about added stimulus for Alberta's economy. So, for example, getting infrastructure money out to Alberta more quickly. For example, fiscal stabilization money that they have been asking for a while, or at least an amendment to the program as it exists. Is that being considered? I know you can't speak for Minister Morneau, but is that being considered by the government?
Well, based on the things that Mr. Morneau said, I think all things are on the table, and all assistance that is needed will be granted, and those are the things that we've heard numerous times in the House of Commons and from various ministers about the importance of making sure that all provinces are doing well.
Mr. Cooper, are you in support of Premier Kenney's ask for more money through the fiscal stabilization program? And if that does happen, would you be understanding that it might add to the deficit?
Well, I'm in favor of lifting the cap, which has been unfair to the province of Alberta, but we need to do more than that. We need a wholesale change in direction, which is why we've put forward a plan to reinvigorate the Canadian economy, starting with tax cuts, rolling back anti-development legislation like the No Pipelines Bill C-69 and Bill C-48, the tanker ban bill, reducing the regulatory burden that is impacting small businesses in such a negative way by bringing forward a 2-for-1 rule, whereby for any new regulation there must be a repeal of 2 regulations. That builds on the current legislated 1-to-1 rule and has been adopted in other provinces like Manitoba and our biggest competitor, that being the United States. And we would eliminate all of the Liberal waste, the hundreds of millions of dollars that have been spent to Liberal corporate friends like Bombardier.
You mentioned tax cuts. Today, I think alone with the drop in the price of oil, federal coffers took a $3 to $4 billion hit. Do you think now is the time to further decrease federal revenues through tax cuts?
Well, it goes back to my point that the Liberal government has left the cupboard bare by spending during the good times with no plan for bad times.
But I'm asking you if that's a wise decision right now at this juncture. I take your point on the bigger picture where the economy is concerned.
We certainly support reducing the tax burden to get back investment, to create greater consumer activity, and to get Canadians working again.
Mr. Julian, based on your suggestions as well, such as more transfers to provincial governments, are you prepared to support additional, a big add to the deficit?
Well, what we believe is there's a fiscal capacity, but we have to stop fueling overseas tax havens and giving money to the wealthiest corporations, the most profitable corporations in Canada. We had $14 billion the banking sector a year and a half ago. The Parliamentary Budgetary Officer estimates it's about $25 billion in tax revenue that is lost to offshore tax havens. And I want to come back to Mr. Cooper's comments about Alberta. We saw Jason Kenney provide tax cuts to the wealthy, and as a result of that, we're seeing a hemorrhaging of public services in Alberta. Of course, a crisis in the education system and healthcare. It simply does not make sense to cut income taxes to the very wealthy. What we actually need is a fairer tax system, and that creates the fiscal capacity to actually provide support.
To be fair, the Conservatives and Premier Kenney, they're concerned about economic growth. We know that it has stagnated. Look at what happened in the last quarter, and they're pitching ideas that they believe will spur that growth.
I don't think that works, and I think many Albertans would say the same thing. We've talked about a clean energy transition, and we have 100,000 capped oil wells in Alberta that could be enormous stimulus for geothermal energy. We're seeing in the United States a boom in clean energy. The federal government needs to step up and start putting investments in place to get energy workers back to work in Alberta and elsewhere in the country in the clean energy sector. That's where the future is.
Okay, I have to wrap it there. But Mr. Cooper, I do want to ask you one question before we leave, because it's my understanding that you attended CPAC in Washington. And we've been watching the U.S. news quite a bit lately. People like Ted Cruz, Doug Collins, they've all self-isolated, people who were at that conference. I'm wondering, have you had any contact with your local public health unit about that, your own behavior, I guess?
I did not come in contact with the individual in any way, and I've been heeding the advice of public health officials, and at this time we're not calling on any restrictions in movement or quarantining.
Okay, so you're pretty clear that you didn't have any contact with that one person, and no one from, I noticed CPAC had reached out to a couple of U.S. politicians. They haven't done so with you?
They have not.
And have you actually individually talked to public health, or is that just information that's shared?
The health department in Maryland, which has been on site, which has been testing, has determined at this time that there is no need to impose restrictions or to quarantine, but that if one has symptoms, to immediately go to public health and get it checked out. I don't have any of the symptoms.
Any sort of worry on your part at all about all of this right now, just given the atmosphere, given sort of the questions around U.S. politicians there, as well as I think Anthony Housefather, another MP who attended a different conference in Washington, he's decided to self-isolate just out of abundance of caution. Are you giving any thought to that?
Again, I will heed the advice of public health officials.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much to all three of you for your time this evening. Really appreciate it. Darren Fisher, Michael Cooper, and Peter Julian.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We will have a lot more